You don't realize what happens next when you stop the wrong person in the wrong city on the wrong morning. The words had barely left the radio silence of downtown Chicago when the black SUV rolled to an abrupt stop at the curb and two police officers stepped out, their presence immediate, practiced, and unquestioned by the small crowd already gathering on the sidewalk. Ava Johnson stood beside her parked car, hands resting calmly at her sides, her expression unreadable as Officer Ryan Miller approached with the kind of certainty that came from never expecting to be wrong. "Step away from the vehicle," he said sharply, eyes scanning her as if the situation had already been decided before she spoke a word. Ava didn't move quickly. She simply turned her head slightly, acknowledging him with a quiet focus that didn't match the tension rising around her. Jason Cole followed a step behind, already looking uncomfortable but continuing forward anyway as bystanders slowed their pace, phones lifting into the air as curiosity turned into attention. The morning air was cool, around 58 degrees, and the city hummed with traffic from Michigan Avenue just 2 blocks away. But everything here felt narrowed into a single point of confrontation. "Ma'am, we received a report matching your description," Ryan continued, voice tightening as he closed the distance, his hand hovering near his belt as if habit alone could define authority. Ava's gaze shifted toward him, steady and composed, and for a brief moment something in the way she stood made Jason hesitate just enough to notice it wasn't fear. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," Ava said evenly, her voice carrying without effort, the kind of tone that didn't invite argument but didn't yield either. A few onlookers murmured, sensing the imbalance of assumption rather than evidence. Ryan frowned, interpreting her calm as resistance, and stepped closer, signaling for her to comply without explaining further. Jason glanced at her identification briefly but didn't speak, as if unsure whether to interrupt what was already unfolding. Ava exhaled once, slow and deliberate, then met Ryan's eyes directly. "You're making a very expensive mistake," she said, not raising her voice, not changing her stance, simply stating it like a fact that already existed beyond their awareness. The words hung in the space between them, unnoticed by Ryan but registered by Jason, who shifted his weight as something about her certainty began to unsettle him. The crowd behind them grew quieter, sensing that this was no longer just a routine stop, but something misaligned, something off balance in a way no one could quite name yet. Ryan gestured again, more forcefully now, insisting she comply immediately, while Ava remained exactly where she stood, neither challenging nor retreating, simply observing as though the situation itself was something she had already seen before in a different context. And in that moment, as the city continued moving around them unaware, the first thread of a larger reversal quietly tightened without anyone yet realizing it had already begun. The silence that followed her words did not last long, but it changed shape in a way that made everything feel slightly off balance. Officer Ryan Miller narrowed his eyes, interpreting her calm as defiance rather than clarity, and motioned again for her to comply with the instructions being given. His partner, Jason Cole, lingered half a step behind, his attention shifting between the woman in front of them and the growing number of bystanders now recording on their phones from a cautious distance of roughly 20 to 30 feet. Ava Johnson remained exactly where she stood, posture steady, hands visible, her gaze moving briefly across the street as if measuring something beyond the immediate confrontation rather than reacting to it. The morning light reflected off nearby glass buildings, casting a muted glow across the sidewalk where tension had begun to replace ordinary city movement. "Ma'am, this situation does not require escalation," Jason said carefully, his tone less certain than his partner's, though still bound by procedure. Ryan did not look at him, instead stepping slightly closer to Ava, as if proximity itself could resolve uncertainty. "You are being instructed to cooperate for standard verification," Ryan added, voice tightening as he gestured toward her identification again, though he had not yet taken the time to properly examine it. Ava tilted her head slightly, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement of something predictable unfolding exactly as she had anticipated. "Verification is already available through your internal system," she said evenly, her voice calm enough that it seemed to slow the energy around them rather than match it. Jason hesitated at that, a subtle shift in posture suggesting he had not expected that response. The crowd behind them grew quieter, the kind of silence that comes when observers begin to sense that the situation is not what it initially appeared to be. A few steps back, someone lowered their phone slightly, reconsidering what they thought they were witnessing. Ryan, however, pressed forward with procedural certainty, interpreting her statement as an attempt to delay compliance rather than as information. "We are not going to debate this on the sidewalk," he said, signaling once more for her to move toward the vehicle. Ava did not resist, did not step back, and did not raise her voice. Instead, she reached slowly into the inner pocket of her coat, her movement deliberate and visible to both officers, prompting Jason to shift his weight again in quiet anticipation. Ryan's hand moved instinctively toward his radio, though he had not yet activated it. When Ava withdrew a slim identification card and held it out at arm's length, neither officer immediately took it. Jason glanced at Ryan first, as if seeking confirmation of protocol, while Ryan briefly scanned the card without accepting it. The name printed there did not register fully at first, not because it was unclear, but because it required context they had not yet accessed. Ava Johnson, Director of Internal Affairs Oversight Division. The words sat between them without immediate reaction, as if the system in their minds was still attempting to reconcile the information with the situation in front of them. Jason blinked once, then again, his expression tightening as recognition began to form in stages rather than instantly. Ryan's posture shifted subtly, not yet stepping back, but no longer advancing with the same certainty. "This must be some kind of misunderstanding," Ryan said, though his tone had changed, losing some of its earlier firmness. Ava did not respond to that statement. Instead, she maintained eye contact long enough for the weight of the moment to settle without assistance. A notification suddenly came through Jason's handheld radio, breaking the ambient sound of traffic and distant sirens. The message was brief, formal, and unmistakably urgent in tone, instructing immediate acknowledgement and verification of active oversight presence in the field. Jason's eyes moved quickly between the device and Ava, his breathing becoming noticeably more measured as realization caught up with procedure. Ryan finally reached for the identification card, this time holding it properly as he read it again with slower comprehension. The change in his expression was not immediate panic, but rather a gradual collapse of certainty, the kind that comes when authority is suddenly placed in the wrong direction. Around them, the crowd sensed the shift before fully understanding it. Phones still raised, but movements now hesitant. Ava lowered her hand without urgency, as though the exchange had already concluded in her mind long before it registered for them. Jason stepped half a pace back, not retreating, but adjusting to a new hierarchy that had just become visible. Ryan's jaw tightened as he processed the implications, his earlier confidence replaced by a controlled stillness that no longer carried dominance. The street noise returned slowly, but it no longer felt like background. It felt like distance. Ava finally spoke again, her voice unchanged in tone, neither elevated nor softened. "Proceeding without verification does not strengthen authority," she said, each word measured and calm, as if reinforcing something procedural rather than personal. The air between them felt narrower now, not from physical space, but from the sudden redistribution of understanding. Jason lowered his gaze briefly, as if recalibrating every assumption he had made in the last few minutes. Ryan remained still, his expression fixed between recognition and reassessment. While Ava stood in the center of it all without shifting her position, as though nothing about her had changed except the way she was now being perceived. And in that quiet reordering of roles, the moment that had begun as a routine stop had already moved beyond anyone's initial expectations, settling into a new reality neither officer had fully accepted yet. The radio silence that followed the identification check was not empty. It was loaded, like a paused breath in a room where everyone suddenly understood they had stepped 1 inch too far without realizing the edge was already there. Officer Ryan Miller stood still for the first time since the encounter began, his hand no longer resting near his belt, his posture shifting from command to something closer to recalculation. Jason Cole, a few feet behind him, lowered his radio slightly as the words from the internal alert continued to echo in his mind, repeating the designation that had appeared on the system seconds earlier. The bystanders who had been filming from roughly 15 to 20 feet away also began to lower their phones, not because they were told to, but because the energy of the moment had changed in a way that made recording feel less like observation and more like intrusion. Ava Johnson remained exactly where she had been since the beginning of the encounter, her presence unchanged, her expression steady, as if the shift in the environment had been anticipated rather than discovered. Ryan finally exhaled, a controlled breath that revealed more uncertainty than he intended to show, and his eyes returned to the identification card in his hand, as though seeing it again might produce a different result. Jason glanced toward Ava and then toward Ryan, the hesitation in his stance now fully visible, as if he was mentally stepping backward through every instruction that had brought them to this point. Confirm identity match with central system, the radio repeated in a calm, automated tone, reinforcing what was already becoming unavoidable. Ryan responded instinctively, his voice quieter now, almost restrained, acknowledging the directive without the authority he had carried moments earlier. The contrast between procedure and perception widened in the space between them, making the sidewalk feel less like a public place and more like a contained environment where roles were being reassigned in real time. Ava's gaze moved briefly toward Jason, not with confrontation, but with a calm awareness that registered his internal conflict without requiring him to voice it. Jason looked down at his device again, confirming what he already knew but had not yet fully accepted, his shoulders subtly lowering as the structure he relied on began to shift. Ryan finally stepped half a pace back, not out of retreat, but out of adjustment, as if distance could help him regain clarity. The surrounding traffic continued normally, cars passing within a few yards, pedestrians moving along the opposite sidewalk without awareness of the specific moment unfolding here, reinforcing how isolated the situation actually was despite its intensity. Ava spoke again, her voice steady and unchanged, not elevated, not softened, simply present. This situation does not require escalation, she repeated, not as a challenge, but as a continuation of a statement that had already been proven in a different language moments earlier. Jason nodded faintly, more to himself than to anyone else, while Ryan tightened his jaw, processing the reversal not as defeat, but as correction. The identification system on Jason's device refreshed once more, confirming status authorization at a level that extended beyond local enforcement jurisdiction, and the confirmation settled into the space, like a final weight being placed on a scale already tipped beyond balance. Ryan finally lowered his hand completely, the last visible sign of procedural assertion dissolving into stillness. The crowd, still gathered at a cautious distance, began to disperse slowly, their curiosity replaced by the realization that there was nothing left to interpret. Ava adjusted her stance slightly, not as a response to them, but as a return to neutrality, as if the interruption had already concluded. Jason stepped fully back now, placing himself beside Ryan rather than behind him, a silent acknowledgement that hierarchy, in this moment, had already been redefined. Ryan looked at Ava once more, this time without assumption, without projection, only observation. And in that brief exchange of recognition, the entire structure of the encounter settled into a new alignment that neither officer had anticipated when they first arrived, leaving only the quiet understanding that authority, when misapplied, does not collapse loudly. It simply stops working in real time. The moment the final system confirmation stabilized on Jason Cole's device, the atmosphere on the sidewalk shifted again, not in escalation but in release, like pressure slowly leaving a sealed container that had been holding tension far beyond its natural limit. Officer Ryan Miller stood motionless for a few seconds longer, his eyes fixed on Ava Johnson, not with resistance anymore, but with a recalibration that came too late to undo the sequence that had already unfolded. Jason remained slightly behind him, watching the same confirmation screen fade into a standard status display, his expression tightening with the realization that every instruction he had followed in the last few minutes had been based on incomplete understanding rather than verified authority. Ava did not move to leave, did not rush the moment, and did not demand acknowledgement. Instead, she remained in place, allowing the silence to define itself without interruption. A light breeze moved through the street, carrying the sound of distant traffic from the next intersection roughly 200 yards away, while pedestrians on the far side of the block resumed their normal pace, as if the earlier disturbance had been absorbed back into the city without leaving visible trace. Ryan finally lowered his head slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition that procedural certainty, without correct identification, had created an unintended failure point in his judgment. Jason glanced once more at Ava, then at Ryan, and then toward the ground, as if attempting to align the experience he had just witnessed with the training that was supposed to guide it. Ava's voice broke the remaining stillness with a calm precision that carried no tension, only closure. "Verification is complete," she said, not as a declaration of victory, but as a statement of resolved status. Ryan nodded once, slowly, his posture no longer rigid, his earlier authority now replaced by professional restraint that acknowledged correction without resistance. Jason exhaled quietly, shifting his stance so that he was no longer oriented toward enforcement but toward transition, signaling that the situation had moved out of active control and into procedural resolution. Around them, the last of the bystanders lowered their devices fully, some stepping away from the curb, others simply turning and continuing down the sidewalk, their curiosity replaced by the quiet understanding that nothing further was going to unfold here in the way they had initially assumed. Ava finally took a small step forward, not toward confrontation, but toward exit, and that single movement was enough to signal that the moment had fully concluded. Ryan instinctively shifted aside to allow passage, his eyes following her briefly, not with suspicion, but with reflection on how quickly certainty can dissolve when it is built on incomplete information. Jason mirrored the movement a half-second later, creating space without instruction, as if the structure of hierarchy had already reassembled itself into something more accurate than what existed before. Ava walked past them at an unhurried pace, her presence unchanged by what had occurred behind her, as the city continued its steady rhythm of footsteps, engines, and distant conversations. The officers remained where they were for a moment after she passed, not speaking immediately, allowing the weight of the interaction to settle into professional memory rather than immediate reaction. Ryan finally broke the silence with a quiet acknowledgement that did not attempt to reinterpret what had happened, only to close it. Jason responded with a brief nod, his attention still fixed on the direction Ava had walked, as if processing how quickly perception and reality had separated and then realigned in the span of minutes. The sidewalk returned fully to its ordinary state, cars moving through the intersection, pedestrians continuing their routines, and the earlier tension dispersing into the broader flow of the city, leaving only the quiet recognition that authority is not diminished by correction, but defined by how it responds when certainty is replaced by verified truth. The quiet that followed the departure of Ava Johnson did not feel like an ending, but rather like a system returning to equilibrium after a disruption that had briefly exposed how fragile assumed certainty can be when it is not supported by full information. Officer Ryan Miller remained near the sidewalk for several seconds longer than necessary, his eyes tracking the direction she had walked until her figure blended into the normal flow of pedestrians near the next intersection. Jason Cole stood a few feet away, reviewing the final system log on his handheld device, confirming once again that the identity verification had completed without contradiction or error. Neither of them spoke immediately, not because protocol required silence, but because the situation demanded internal processing more than external reaction. Ryan finally adjusted his posture, exhaling through his nose in a controlled manner as if attempting to reset the moment into something more manageable within professional boundaries. Jason glanced toward him, then spoke in a calm tone that carried no accusation, only reflection. "That escalated faster than standard assessment parameters allow," he said, not as criticism, but as recognition of procedural misalignment. Ryan nodded once, acknowledging the statement without verbal response, his attention still partially anchored in the realization that the initial assumption had been based on incomplete validation. A few steps behind them, the last bystander who had been recording lowered their phone completely and walked away, leaving only ambient city motion in the background. Traffic at the intersection approximately 1 block away continued uninterrupted, the sound of engines and crosswalk signals reinforcing the return of normalcy. Jason placed his device back into his pocket, then added quietly, System confirmation placed her at oversight authority level above field jurisdiction. Ryan did not respond immediately, instead looking down the sidewalk as if replaying each decision point in sequence, evaluating where procedural confidence had overridden verification discipline. After a brief pause, he finally spoke in a measured tone. "We followed initial dispatch parameters," he said, not as justification, but as structured reflection. Jason nodded again, understanding the distinction between compliance and interpretation within field conditions. Neither officer attempted to reinterpret the outcome as anything other than corrected classification. A passing delivery truck moved through the intersection, briefly interrupting the soundscape before fading into distance, emphasizing how quickly moments of disruption are absorbed by urban rhythm without residual acknowledgement. Ryan turned slightly toward Jason. "We should submit a full review summary," he said, now fully back in procedural mindset. Jason agreed without hesitation, already anticipating the administrative requirement that would follow any encounter involving override-level identification. Meanwhile, several blocks away, Ava Johnson continued walking at an unhurried pace, her posture unchanged, her attention no longer on the earlier encounter, but on the continuation of her scheduled movement through the city. She checked a subtle wrist display once, confirming timing alignment with her next appointment window, which was approximately 20 minutes away. The street she entered gradually widened into a corridor of mixed office buildings and pedestrian crossings, where the density of movement increased but the atmosphere remained neutral and uninterrupted. Inside a nearby Federal Coordination Office located roughly 15 minutes away by vehicle, a notification alert had already reached a secure monitoring terminal, indicating that internal affairs oversight identification had been activated in a field interaction log. A supervisor on duty reviewed the entry briefly, noting timestamp accuracy and jurisdictional overlap, then flagged it for standard documentation rather than escalation, recognizing that the presence of oversight authority in field verification typically required only procedural closure. No alarm was triggered, no emergency protocol initiated, only structured acknowledgement recorded within the system. Back on the street, Ryan and Jason finally began walking toward their patrol vehicle parked approximately 60 feet away, their conversation shifting naturally toward documentation requirements and after-action reporting format. Jason broke the silence again, this time with a more analytical tone. "It is uncommon for oversight-level presence to occur without prior dispatch notification," he said. Ryan responded after a short pause. "Not uncommon in error correction scenarios involving misidentification." The statement was not defensive, but analytical, reflecting a return to training rather than reaction. As they reached the vehicle, Ryan paused briefly before opening the door, glancing once more in the direction Ava had gone, not with uncertainty, but with recognition that the system had functioned as designed even if human perception had not initially aligned with it. Jason entered the passenger side and began logging final notes, his focus fully restored to procedural accuracy. Ryan closed the driver door and sat for a moment before starting the engine, allowing the internal record of the encounter to settle into documentation rather than memory interpretation. Above them, the city continued without interruption, carrying forward as if nothing had occurred, while within structured systems of oversight, the event had already been categorized, confirmed, and archived as a completed correction of field-level assumption. The city had already moved on by the time the internal records began synchronizing across oversight channels, but within the secure framework of federal coordination systems, the encounter involving Ava Johnson was still actively being processed through layered verification logs and jurisdictional confirmation protocols. Ava herself was now seated inside a controlled access conference space located on the upper floor of a government oversight facility approximately 8 miles from the original sidewalk location, where ambient lighting remained neutral and sound was reduced to a near-constant low hum designed to minimize distraction during administrative review. She placed her identification card on the table in front of her without urgency, as a senior analyst across from her reviewed the finalized field report that had been automatically generated from the officer's handheld system submissions. The analyst, a middle-aged man with a calm and methodical presence, did not display surprise. only procedural acknowledgement as he scanned the sequence of events line by line. Field officers confirmed identity at system level within 3 minutes of initial engagement, he stated, more to the record than to Ava herself. Ava nodded once, her attention remaining steady, her posture composed in a way that suggested this was not an unusual outcome, but a controlled confirmation of expected protocol behavior. Across the table, a secondary monitor displayed the time-stamped interaction log, including audio fragments, system verification responses, and jurisdictional classification updates that had occurred in real time during the sidewalk encounter. The analyst continued, no escalation authorization was triggered beyond standard compliance threshold. Resolution classified as procedural correction. Ava did not respond verbally, as silence was consistent with her role within this review structure, allowing the system to define outcome categorization without emotional framing. In a separate building across the city, officers Ryan Miller and Jason Cole were seated inside a small administrative review room, each composing independent statements into structured digital forms that required precise chronological reconstruction of the event. Ryan paused briefly before typing, reviewing his earlier assumptions not with defensiveness, but with measured reflection, recognizing that initial perception had not aligned with verified classification. Jason, seated beside him, adjusted his posture slightly as he entered final notes, emphasizing system confirmation timing and the moment of identity verification override recognition. Neither officer spoke during this process, as procedural documentation required individual narrative accuracy rather than collaborative interpretation. Meanwhile, back in the oversight facility, Ava was briefly joined by a senior director of field operations who entered the room with a quiet acknowledgement before sitting across from her. Your presence in an active field misclassification scenario was logged without prior dispatch notification, he stated, referencing standard protocol deviation analysis. Ava replied calmly, Oversight authority does not require predictive dispatch when correction parameters are triggered externally. The director nodded, accepting the statement without challenge, as this aligned with established policy framework. A brief pause followed as the analyst finalized the report closure stamp, indicating that the incident had been fully resolved at all operational levels. Outside the building, the afternoon light had shifted slightly, with temperature readings showing approximately 68 degrees Fahrenheit and light wind movement across the surrounding streets. Traffic patterns remained consistent, and pedestrian flow continued uninterrupted, reinforcing the administrative reality that most systemic corrections occur without public awareness or disruption. Inside the review room, the director closed the file on his tablet and added a final note confirming compliance validation. Ava stood smoothly, retrieving her identification card and placing it back into her jacket pocket before preparing to leave. There was no sense of urgency in her movement, only continuation of scheduled oversight responsibilities that extended beyond any single field interaction. As she exited the room, the analyst briefly glanced at the finalized record and then at the director, who simply stated, procedure held as designed. In the administrative processing system, the event was now fully archived, indexed under correction classification, and marked complete. At the same time, Ryan and Jason had completed their documentation and submitted their reports into the departmental database, each entry aligning within acceptable variance thresholds for field interpretation correction. Ryan leaned back slightly after submission, exhaling in a way that suggested mental closure rather than emotional reaction. Jason gathered his belongings and prepared to leave, briefly noting that system accuracy had ultimately resolved the encounter without conflict. Neither officer revisited the incident verbally after submission, as departmental protocol shifted focus from event reflection to procedural continuity. Across the city, Ava walked out of the oversight facility into the open air, where sunlight reflected off nearby glass buildings, and the normal rhythm of movement continued without interruption. She paused briefly at the edge of the sidewalk, confirming her next scheduled appointment on a subtle wrist interface before continuing forward at an unhurried pace. The system behind her had already concluded its assessment, but the city itself remained unchanged, carrying forward its ordinary motion as if the correction that had occurred within it had always been part of its expected structure rather than an exception. The afternoon light over the city had begun to soften, shifting from sharp daylight into a more diffused glow that reflected off the glass surfaces of downtown buildings. While Ava Johnson continued her movement through the structured rhythm of scheduled oversight responsibilities without interruption or deviation. Her path led along a wide pedestrian corridor bordered by federal offices and private institutions, where foot traffic increased gradually as professionals exited buildings for mid-afternoon transitions. She maintained an even pace, her focus aligned with internal timing rather than external environment, as if each step was coordinated with a system only she could see. Behind her, the oversight facility had already fully archived the earlier field incident, locking it into procedural history with classification tags that required no further review unless future anomalies were detected. Inside that system, the interaction between Ava and the field officers had been reduced to structured data points, stripped of emotional variance, and preserved only as compliance validation evidence. At the same time, in a separate administrative building several blocks away, Officers Ryan Miller and Jason Cole completed their final submission confirmation screens, each receiving system acknowledgement that their reports had been successfully recorded under correction protocol documentation. Ryan briefly remained seated after submitting his file, his hands resting on the edge of the desk as he reviewed the closing system message that indicated no further action required. Jason, already standing, adjusted his uniform slightly and exhaled in a controlled manner before placing his device back into his pocket. Neither officer spoke, as the procedural environment did not require further verbalization once documentation closure had been confirmed. Ryan eventually stood as well, turning slightly toward Jason, and after a brief pause, he said in a neutral tone, "Case closed under standard correction classification." Jason nodded once, acknowledging the statement without additional commentary, and together they exited the review room into the corridor where routine departmental activity continued unchanged. Across the city, Ava entered a transition zone between federal district boundaries and commercial pedestrian space, where the density of movement increased and ambient sound became more layered with conversation, vehicle flow, and distant construction activity. She paused briefly at a crosswalk, waiting for the signal cycle to complete, and during that moment she reviewed a subtle schedule update on her wrist interface indicating a meeting adjustment approximately 40 minutes ahead. The adjustment had been automatically synchronized with her oversight calendar following the earlier procedural resolution, requiring no manual intervention. As the pedestrian signal changed, she moved forward with the flow of people crossing the intersection, maintaining the same composed posture that had remained unchanged throughout the day. On the far side of the intersection, a group of office workers passed within a few feet of her, none recognizing her beyond ordinary urban anonymity, which aligned with standard operational expectations for oversight field presence. Inside the Federal Coordination Network, a final system audit cycle completed its background verification sweep, confirming that no outstanding alerts or unresolved flags remained associated with the earlier incident. The audit result was automatically forwarded to supervisory archives, where it was reviewed and stamped as complete without escalation recommendation. In parallel, Ryan and Jason had reached the building exit and stepped into the outside air, where the temperature had risen slightly to approximately 69 degrees Fahrenheit, and the afternoon sun cast longer shadows across the pavement. Jason checked his watch briefly, then adjusted his direction toward the nearby transit station, while Ryan walked toward his assigned vehicle located in the adjacent parking structure. As they separated, Jason spoke one final observation in a calm voice. System response time was faster than expected for override classification recognition. Ryan responded without hesitation, verification infrastructure has improved field correction latency. Neither elaborated further, as both understood that the remainder of discussion would be unnecessary within procedural closure context. Meanwhile, Ava continued forward through the city streets, her movement uninterrupted, her presence blending seamlessly into the flow of professionals, commuters, and pedestrians who filled the surrounding environment. The earlier encounter, now fully archived and classified, existed only within structured system memory, no longer active within operational awareness. As she approached the next intersection, she slowed slightly, then adjusted her direction toward a nearby building entrance marked for scheduled oversight engagement. The doors opened automatically as she approached, and she stepped inside without pause, transitioning from public space into controlled interior environment. Behind her, the city continued its normal rhythm without indication that any deviation had occurred, while within institutional systems, the event had already been finalized, categorized, and sealed under correction protocol completion status. The automatic doors of the oversight facility closed behind Ava Johnson with a soft mechanical seal, marking the transition from public city space into a controlled interior environment where lighting, sound, and movement were all regulated by design rather than chance. Inside, the atmosphere shifted immediately into structured quiet, with polished floors reflecting soft overhead illumination and distant footsteps echoing in measured intervals that suggested disciplined workflow rather than casual movement. Ava continued forward without hesitation, following a corridor that led deeper into the building, her pace steady and aligned with internal scheduling markers displayed subtly on her wrist interface. Ahead of her, a secure access point recognized her credentials instantly, unlocking without delay and allowing her to enter a restricted coordination chamber where several analysts were already reviewing live system summaries from multiple field operations. None of them reacted to her arrival beyond brief acknowledgement, as her presence was integrated into the operational hierarchy of the space rather than treated as an exception. She took a position at the central table, where a digital display projected the finalized report of the earlier sidewalk interaction, now fully categorized under correction protocol completion status. The lead analyst, seated across from her, adjusted the display slightly and spoke in a calm professional tone, stating that all field data had been verified, cross-referenced, and archived without unresolved discrepancies. Ava nodded once, her attention focused on the structured breakdown of procedural alignment metrics that confirmed system response accuracy across jurisdictional layers. In a separate part of the city, Officers Ryan Miller and Jason Cole had already separated after exiting their departmental review location, each moving through familiar transit routes that returned them to standard duty rotation schedules. Ryan sat in the driver's seat of his assigned vehicle for a brief moment before starting the engine, his expression neutral but reflective as he considered the sequence of events that had unfolded earlier in the day. Jason, standing near a transit platform approximately half a mile away, checked his schedule update confirming that his next assignment had been reassigned without disruption, indicating that no further involvement in the earlier incident would be required. Neither officer communicated further about the encounter, as departmental protocol discouraged revisiting resolved correction classifications once documentation had been finalized. Inside the oversight facility, Ava reviewed a secondary report layer that displayed system performance indicators, including identity verification response time, jurisdictional override accuracy, and field compliance adjustment latency. The data confirmed that all automated systems had functioned within expected parameters, reinforcing procedural reliability even under initial misclassification conditions. The analyst beside her concluded the briefing by stating that no additional review cycles were required unless future anomalies involving similar field conditions were detected. Ava acknowledged the statement with a brief nod, then closed the report interface, signaling completion of her review participation. She stood from the table and moved toward the exit corridor, her posture unchanged, her focus already shifting toward the next scheduled engagement. As she walked, the environment remained consistent in its controlled precision, with minimal ambient noise and structured movement patterns from staff conducting parallel operations. Outside the facility, the city had transitioned fully into late afternoon conditions, with sunlight casting longer reflections across building surfaces and pedestrian traffic maintaining steady flow through intersections and walkways. Ryan had reached his residential return route by this time, parking his vehicle in a designated structure before stepping out into the quieter surroundings of his neighborhood, where the contrast between professional procedure and personal environment became more noticeable. Jason had also reached his next transit connection, boarding without incident and settling into a seat as the system of daily operations continued without interruption or reference to earlier events. In the oversight facility, Ava paused briefly near a large glass partition that overlooked the city skyline, where distant movement of vehicles and pedestrians appeared as coordinated patterns beneath shifting light conditions. She observed for a moment without focus on any single point, then turned away, continuing toward a secondary corridor that would lead her to a scheduled briefing room for upcoming oversight coordination. The earlier interaction involving field officers, now fully resolved and archived, remained only as structured data within institutional memory systems, no longer active in operational awareness or decision-making. As Ava proceeded deeper into the building, the system around her maintained its quiet equilibrium, reinforcing the procedural reality that every disruption, once corrected and verified, becomes part of the same stable framework it once appeared to challenge, leaving behind only documentation, confirmation, and continued motion within an unchanged city. Inside the controlled interior of the oversight facility, the lighting remained consistent and neutral, casting a soft, even tone across the polished surfaces of the coordination chamber where Ava Johnson had paused near the secondary interface station. The city beyond the glass walls appeared distant and structured, with movement below reduced to abstract patterns of traffic flow and pedestrian synchronization, as if viewed through a filtered layer of operational detachment. Ava stood still for a moment, her attention directed toward a live analytical display that continued to cycle through finalized data from the earlier field correction event, now fully archived yet still visible in summary format for internal review continuity. The system showed no anomalies, no unresolved flags, and no pending escalation requests, only a clean procedural closure sequence that confirmed the stability of jurisdictional response alignment. A senior analyst nearby adjusted a secondary panel and spoke in a measured tone, stating that cross-jurisdictional verification logs had been successfully reconciled with federal oversight databases, ensuring that all interaction points involving officers Ryan Miller and Jason Cole had been properly indexed under correction classification. Ava acknowledged the update with a subtle nod, her expression unchanged, as if confirming a routine status rather than reviewing a complex field deviation that had occurred only hours earlier. In another part of the city, Ryan Miller had returned to standard patrol duty rotation preparation, sitting inside a briefing room where the lighting was slightly warmer and less controlled than the oversight facility, yet still structured enough to maintain professional focus. He reviewed his assignment board silently, noting that his next scheduled field rotation had been adjusted to a lower priority zone, consistent with procedural redistribution following corrected classification events. Jason Cole, in a separate administrative wing, completed his shift summary entry and submitted final acknowledgement that no further action was required regarding the earlier encounter. Both officers remained within standard operational flow, their roles continuing without interruption, as the system had fully absorbed the earlier misclassification into procedural history. Back inside the oversight facility, Ava moved away from the display and toward a quieter corridor that led to a transitional briefing room used for scheduled coordination updates. Her pace remained steady, and her attention remained forward-focused, reflecting the structured rhythm of her responsibilities rather than any residual engagement with the earlier field event. Along the corridor, ambient system indicators displayed real-time operational status updates, confirming that all active correction cases had returned to baseline stability and that no secondary review cycles had been triggered. As she passed through a glass partition overlooking the city, Ava briefly observed the movement below, where vehicles and pedestrians continued their normal progression through late afternoon conditions, unaware of the administrative recalibration that had recently occurred above their level of visibility. The analyst team behind her concluded their final review sequence, marking the case file as fully closed with no additional commentary required, and transferring it into long-term archival storage. This action signaled the end of active engagement with the event, reducing it from operational awareness to historical record within the system. At street level, Ryan Miller stepped out of the briefing room and into the exterior corridor of the precinct building, where ambient light had begun to shift toward early evening tones. He paused briefly before exiting completely, taking a moment to adjust his posture and reorient his focus towards standard duty expectations that no longer included reference to the earlier encounter. Jason Cole had already left the building and was walking toward his vehicle, his attention now fully separated from the procedural memory of the event, as departmental structure required forward operational continuity without retention of unresolved interpretive framing. Inside the oversight facility, Ava entered the designated briefing room where a small group of coordinators were already reviewing upcoming operational schedules. She took her position without delay, and the system immediately integrated her presence into the active planning interface, updating displays to reflect her involvement in the next sequence of oversight coordination tasks. The earlier incident involving field officers, now fully resolved and archived, remained accessible only through historical query channels, no longer influencing active decision pathways or real-time system behavior. A coordinator briefly referenced the completed correction event during a status overview, noting that field response accuracy metrics had remained within acceptable thresholds despite initial misclassification, and that system override recognition had functioned as intended. Ava listened without reaction, her focus aligned with the current briefing content rather than the archived sequence. Outside, the city continued its transition toward evening, with lighting shifting across buildings and streets in gradual tonal change, reinforcing the continuity of daily rhythm that persisted regardless of internal procedural adjustments. Within the oversight facility, the meeting progressed into standard operational planning, with no further reference to the earlier event beyond its formal closure status. As Ava remained seated at the table, reviewing the next sequence of scheduled responsibilities, the system around her maintained its consistent equilibrium, confirming that all prior deviations had been resolved, all corrections validated, and all interactions fully integrated into the structured framework of operational stability that governed both field response and oversight continuity. The oversight facility had transitioned into a deeper operational phase where routine coordination had resumed, yet beneath the surface of standardized workflow, a secondary analytical process began to activate within a restricted monitoring layer reserved for delayed anomaly detection and cross-jurisdictional behavioral review. Ava Johnson remained seated within the coordination briefing room, her attention directed toward the current agenda of upcoming oversight schedules. But within the broader system architecture, a separate audit sequence had quietly reinitialized based on pattern recognition thresholds that had not fully resolved during the earlier field correction closure. The change was subtle, appearing first as a background recalibration within data synchronization logs rather than a direct alert, and it passed unnoticed by most analysts focused on immediate operational tasks. However, within the Central Federal Monitoring Network, an automated integrity scan flagged a minor inconsistency in external observation metadata associated with the earlier sidewalk interaction involving officers Ryan Miller and Jason Cole. The inconsistency did not indicate procedural failure, but rather a timing discrepancy between identity verification confirmation and jurisdictional acknowledgement logging. At the same time, across the city in a separate administrative division, Ryan Miller had just begun a standard end-of-shift documentation review when his terminal displayed a secondary notification requesting clarification on a previously submitted field report. The request was not marked urgent, but it carried a classification tag indicating follow-up verification under extended oversight review parameters. Ryan paused, reading the message carefully, then leaned slightly closer to the screen as he recognized that the request originated from a higher-tier compliance monitoring unit than the one that had initially processed his report. Jason Cole, seated nearby in a different workstation cluster, noticed the same notification appear on his interface moments later, prompting a brief exchange of glances between them that required no verbal confirmation. Both understood that while the original incident had been closed under correction protocol, the system had identified a need for additional contextual alignment. Meanwhile, within the oversight facility, Ava stood briefly from her seat as the briefing transitioned into a scheduled intermission period. She moved toward a secondary observation corridor where large transparent panels overlooked the city skyline, now transitioning fully into early evening conditions with ambient lighting shifting toward cooler tones. As she observed the city below, her wrist interface displayed a subtle update indicating that a system-level audit flag had been attached to her earlier field presence record, not as an error, but as a procedural confirmation checkpoint. This type of audit was not uncommon in oversight operations, particularly when identity verification interactions involved cross-jurisdictional authority levels that required delayed confirmation cycles. Ava acknowledged the update internally without altering her posture, maintaining her focus on the broader operational structure rather than isolated procedural branches. Back at the administrative precinct, Ryan Miller received a follow-up directive requesting a more detailed chronological reconstruction of his interaction sequence, including precise timing of compliance adjustment recognition. He began reviewing his initial report, noting each step with increased precision, aware that the system was not questioning his judgment, but refining the accuracy of its internal modeling. Jason Cole was issued a similar request, prompting him to reconstruct his observational timeline with emphasis on system confirmation response latency and environmental context during the interaction. Neither officer expressed concern, as the tone of the requests remained procedural rather than disciplinary, yet both recognized that the oversight network was engaged in a deeper level of verification than the initial closure had suggested. At the same time, within a restricted analytical node in the Federal Coordination System, a secondary data stream flagged the presence of a passive tracking anomaly linked to external observation patterns recorded during the original field event. The anomaly did not disrupt system stability, but it indicated that an unidentified external observer had briefly engaged monitoring equipment near the intersection during the interaction window, creating a trace record that required classification review. This discovery was routed to a higher-level supervisory channel, where it would be evaluated alongside Ava Johnson's operational record to determine whether the anomaly held relevance to oversight integrity or was simply an unrelated environmental coincidence. Ava, now returning to the main briefing room, rejoined the ongoing coordination session where agenda items had progressed to next cycle deployment planning. Her presence was acknowledged only through system interface integration, and the meeting continued without interruption. However, within the underlying network architecture, the earlier field interaction had now expanded beyond a simple correction case and entered a secondary review phase that analyzed external influence vectors and timing synchronization accuracy. In the city below, Ryan Miller completed his revised report draft and submitted it into the system once again, this time with enhanced detail and adjusted sequencing accuracy. Jason Cole followed shortly after, ensuring that his version aligned with both procedural expectations and observed environmental conditions. Neither officer had direct awareness of the external tracking anomaly, yet both sensed implicitly that the earlier encounter had generated a level of system attention that extended beyond standard field correction closure. Inside the oversight facility, Ava remained composed as the coordination meeting concluded its current agenda segment, and participants transitioned into the next operational topic without reference to the audit flag now associated with her earlier field presence. The system continued its layered evaluation in the background, correlating all available data points across jurisdictional and observational channels, preparing a consolidated integrity report that would determine whether the anomaly required future action or could be absorbed into neutral classification. As Ava exited the briefing room and moved toward the corridor leading deeper into the facility, the city outside continued its steady transition into night, with lights activating across buildings and streets in a synchronized pattern of urban continuity, while within the unseen architecture of oversight systems, a quiet but expanding review process continued to unfold, suggesting that even resolved events can generate echoes that persist beyond closure when observed from within the full depth of institutional awareness. The internal audit cycle that had quietly expanded across the oversight network continued to develop in layers that were not immediately visible to field-level personnel, but were becoming increasingly structured within the higher-order analytical systems responsible for cross-jurisdictional integrity evaluation. Within this evolving framework, Ava Johnson remained in motion inside the oversight facility, moving through a series of interconnected corridors that linked operational briefing areas with restricted analytical chambers designed for extended review cycles and delayed anomaly correlation. The lighting remained consistent throughout, maintaining a neutral tone that eliminated environmental distraction, while subtle system indicators embedded in wall-mounted interfaces continued to update in real time with data streams from multiple federal monitoring nodes. Ava did not alter her pace as she transitioned between sections of the facility, her focus remaining aligned with scheduled responsibilities that extended into the next operational cycle. However, within the background infrastructure of the system, the earlier field interaction involving officers Ryan Miller and Jason Cole had now progressed beyond standard correction classification and into a multi-layer review state that incorporated external observation analysis, timing sequence validation, and behavioral response calibration. This phase of evaluation was not triggered by error, but by pattern sensitivity thresholds designed to detect inconsistencies that might otherwise remain undetected within isolated procedural logs. In a separate location across the city, Ryan Miller sat alone in a quiet administrative room designated for final reflection submissions, though the purpose was not emotional reflection, but structured clarification of procedural accuracy. He reviewed his reconstructed timeline once more, focusing on exact sequence alignment between initial dispatch arrival, identity verification recognition, and jurisdictional status update confirmation. Each entry had already been submitted once, but the system had requested refinement based on micro-discrepancy analysis that compared field audio logs with system response timestamps. Ryan adjusted several entries with careful precision, ensuring that each moment was represented in a way that aligned with verified system outputs rather than personal perception of event flow. He paused briefly, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition that the system was now reconstructing the event with greater clarity than human observation alone had initially provided. Jason Cole, working in a parallel review station nearby, was performing the same structured refinement process, his attention focused on aligning environmental observation notes with system-confirmed identity resolution timing. Neither officer was under disciplinary review, yet both understood that the depth of system analysis indicated a higher than standard level of interest in procedural fidelity. At the federal coordination level, the anomaly flagged in the previous cycle had now been fully integrated into a composite evaluation model that compared external environmental observation patterns against authorized system access records during the exact time frame of the sidewalk interaction. The analysis revealed a brief but measurable interference pattern consistent with passive external monitoring activity positioned within approximately 150 feet of the engagement zone. This data point did not alter the classification of the original event, but it introduced a secondary review layer focused on determining whether external observation influenced perception latency or contributed to initial misclassification behavior. Ava, now entering a restricted observation corridor within the oversight facility, paused near a transparent interface wall that displayed a live aggregate of system integrity metrics across multiple ongoing operations. Her presence triggered an automatic update within the system, confirming her continued engagement within active oversight rotation. She reviewed the anomaly summary briefly, her expression unchanged, as the system displayed correlation data linking the earlier field interaction to broader monitoring protocols that extended across multiple jurisdictional domains. The analytical framework suggested that while the interaction itself had been fully resolved at procedural level, its metadata footprint required continued passive monitoring due to the presence of external observational irregularities. Meanwhile, Ryan Miller completed his final revision and submitted the updated report, receiving immediate confirmation that the system had accepted the refined sequence as the authoritative version of record. Jason Cole followed shortly thereafter, completing his own submission with identical confirmation results. Both officers then exited their respective review stations, returning to standard duty pathways without further reference to the event. Inside the oversight facility, Ava proceeded toward a secondary briefing chamber where upcoming operational assignments were being prepared for distribution across multiple oversight teams. As she moved, the system quietly integrated the anomaly evaluation into its long-term monitoring structure, flagging it for continued passive observation rather than active intervention. The city outside continued its transition into full evening conditions, with artificial lighting increasing across buildings and streets, while vehicular movement formed steady patterns of controlled flow that mirrored the structured consistency of institutional systems operating above it. Ava reached the entrance of the briefing chamber and entered without pause, where several coordinators were already engaged in forward scheduling discussions that would define the next operational cycle. The anomaly linked to her earlier field presence remained active only within background analytical layers, no longer influencing immediate decision pathways, but preserved within system memory for continuity assessment. In the administrative network, the final stage of the review sequence confirmed that all known variables had been accounted for, while the external observation signal remained categorized as non-disruptive but persistently recorded. As the meeting inside the chamber continued, Ava maintained her position within the operational framework, her roles seamlessly integrated into the structured flow of oversight coordination. Outside, the city remained unaware of the layered systems analyzing, correcting, and continuously refining the invisible structure that governed its operational stability, leaving behind only the quiet certainty that even fully resolved events can continue to exist within deeper analytical memory as points of reference for future systemic calibration. The final stage of the oversight cycle had settled into a complete state of systemic equilibrium, where all active review threads, anomaly evaluations, and field correction validations had been closed, archived, and locked into long-term institutional memory without remaining instability indicators. Within the oversight facility, Ava Johnson moved through the final corridor leading toward the primary exit hub, her pace unchanging, her posture composed, and her attention fully aligned with the next scheduled operational engagement that awaited her beyond the current cycle. The environment around her remained controlled and consistent, with soft ambient lighting reflecting across polished surfaces and minimal sound interference allowing uninterrupted cognitive transition between completed and upcoming responsibilities. Behind her, the coordination chamber had already transitioned into inactive status for the current operational segment, with all briefing outputs finalized and distributed across interconnected oversight divisions. System displays confirmed that every procedural element associated with the earlier field interaction, including identity verification correction, jurisdictional adjustment, and anomaly classification review, had reached full resolution status. No alerts remained active, no secondary flags persisted, and all analytical models had returned to baseline predictive stability. In a separate layer of the Federal Coordination Network, the external observation anomaly that had been previously flagged during extended review cycles had now been fully integrated into historical pattern datasets, where it was categorized as non-influencing environmental interference with no measurable impact on procedural outcomes. The system confirmed final closure of all investigative branches associated with the event, including cross-jurisdictional timing analysis and passive monitoring correlation. Within the city, officers Ryan Miller and Jason Cole had already resumed full standard duty operations, their earlier involvement in the correction sequence now reduced to archived reference entries within departmental systems. Ryan was assigned to a new patrol rotation covering a lower priority urban sector, where operational activity followed predictable procedural patterns without deviation risk indicators. Jason continued administrative processing work involving unrelated field documentation, his attention fully redirected toward current assignments without residual engagement in prior events. Neither officer received further communication regarding the oversight anomaly resolution, as the matter had been fully absorbed into higher-level institutional closure systems that required no additional field-level awareness. Within the oversight facility, Ava entered the final transitional corridor leading to the exterior exit zone, where system authentication nodes confirmed her clearance for departure without delay. As she approached the exit threshold, a final consolidated system summary was displayed across a transparent interface panel, indicating full operational stability across all reviewed processes, including field correction validation, anomaly resolution, and cross-jurisdictional data reconciliation. The summary confirmed that all earlier discrepancies had been fully resolved within acceptable system variance parameters and that no further monitoring escalation was required. Ava paused briefly at the threshold, not in hesitation, but in recognition of procedural completion, then proceeded forward as the automatic doors opened with precise synchronization. Outside, the city had fully transitioned into evening conditions, with structured lighting illuminating streets, intersections, and building facades in a coordinated pattern that reflected the underlying order of urban operational systems. Traffic moved steadily through regulated pathways, and pedestrian flow continued without interruption, maintaining the natural rhythm of metropolitan activity that persisted regardless of internal oversight cycles operating above it. As Ava stepped into the exterior environment, her presence blended seamlessly into the broader movement of the city, her role continuing within the extended framework of oversight operations that extended beyond any single event or correction sequence. Behind her, the oversight facility completed its final system refresh for the operational day, locking all completed records into secure archival storage and initiating baseline monitoring mode for future cycle readiness. Within this stabilized structure, the earlier sidewalk interaction, the identity verification correction, and the anomaly evaluation existed only as finalized data points within a fully resolved procedural framework, no longer active, no longer evolving, and no longer influencing real-time decision pathways. The system maintained its continuous equilibrium, confirming that every deviation had been corrected, every discrepancy reconciled, and every operational thread returned to structured alignment. Ava continued walking into the evening cityscape, her movement steady and unbroken, as the oversight network behind her sustained its silent function, preserving the balance between field reality and institutional precision, where even the most complex disruptions ultimately returned to order, leaving behind only verified records, completed cycles, and the quiet assurance of systemic stability.